Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. We're calling this Religious Liberty in the Public Square. Is free speech under attack? My name is Steve Allred, and I'm the Religious Liberty Liaison for the Northern California Conference here in Northern California. And, you know, free speech and religious liberty are often connected. And that is because many aspects of religion require expression, right? And so when free speech is repressed, religion often suffers as well, and vice versa. And we see this played out, of course, in oppressive regimes around the world, as people of various religious persuasions are often persecuted for sharing their faith or expressing ideas that are considered dangerous to the powers that be. Well, we Americans, of course, live in a country where the First Amendment to our Constitution protects both religion and free speech, where we aim to value pluralism, right? And the viewpoint diversity here in this country. However, some people feel like free speech is under attack, even here in America, through things like social media censorship and even sometimes actions that state, local, or federal government can take in regard to free speech, which we'll discuss more as we get into our webinar today. For example, here's one example that's been a real hot button issue recently. We're not going to get into the talking about this much, but the issue of the COVID vaccine and people's religious objections to it, and people feeling like if they post on social media about that and those posts are removed, that is a both censorship and violation of their free speech rights as well as their religious rights. Others, such as Jews and Muslims, may be concerned for their own safety as the result of hate speech against them that is circulated online. We're going to hear a little bit more about that today. So here's some questions we're going to ask today. What are the limits of free speech? When does the First Amendment protect speech? And how does all of this relate to religious liberty, either now or perhaps down the road? Maybe it could kind of pave the way for things that could, impact religious liberty in the future. So, this is a church program. I want to state this at the outset. And our goal here is to discuss issues relevant to religion and religious liberty. We don't want to engage in discussing political issues just for the fun of it, or take sides on controversial issues that are irrelevant to religion and religious liberty. But we also realize that these issues and principles that we'll discuss today do relate to religious liberty. And so we feel it's important to discuss them. And our goal here today is hopefully to educate and enlighten so that we as people of faith, no matter what faith perspective we're coming from, can do our best to speak truth in love in a society that is often divided by lies and misinformation. So today, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests. And we have two esteemed guests that have taken time out of their busy schedules to join us today. Let me first of all bring in Bettina Krause. Welcome, Bettina.
Good to be with you.
And you're coming to us all the way from the East Coast, and we appreciate you being here. Let me just introduce you with a little short bio here. Bettina Krause is editor of Liberty magazine, and I'm going to just hold this up so everyone can see the latest issue of Liberty, which is a great magazine. If you're not a subscriber, I want to say this to our viewers, you need to be a subscriber. I will tell you that. It's a great, I don't make any money off saying that. I've been a subscriber for years, and it's just got all sorts of really up-to-date, relevant, and just good perspective in there. So, Bettina, you're the editor of Liberty magazine. You're also an associate director of the North American division of the Seventh Adventist Church's Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department. You previously served as an associate director for the General Conference Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department, with responsibility for government affairs. You represented the World Church in Washington, D.C. You engaged with Congress and the White House, as well as the diplomatic, international, and NGO communities headquartered there in Washington. And prior to this, Bettina served the then General Conference President Pastor Jan Paulson as a special assistant for global initiatives. And she holds a law degree from Macquarie, am I saying that right? Macquarie University Law School in Sydney, Australia.
You almost have the Australian accent. Well done.
All right. Well, it's good to have you here. And let me bring in Professor Alan Brownstein. Oops, there we are. Professor Alan Brownstein, welcome, and thank you for being here as well.
Glad to be here, Steve.
Now, Professor Brownstein comes to us from the University of California Davis School of Law, which isn't too far from where I'm sitting right now in Roseville, just a short drive away. And he is a nationally recognized constitutional law scholar. He teaches constitutional law, law and religion, and torts at UC Davis School of Law. While the primary focus of his scholarship relates to church-state issues and free exercise and Establishment Clause doctrine, he has also written extensively on freedom of speech, privacy and autonomy rights, and other constitutional law subjects. A graduate of Antioch College and Harvard Law School, Brownstein was an attorney in general litigation and corporate practice before joining the UC Davis Law faculty. And then from 1977 to 78, he clerked for the Honorable Frank M. Coffin, Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit in Portland, Maine. I didn't realize that you'd been out in Portland, Maine until I read that, but that's pretty cool.
It was a wonderful place to spend a year, and Judge Coffin was a wonderful judge. He was what Jews call a mensch. Very good person.
Good. You know, I was going to just share this with our viewers on your, a page at the UC Davis Law School, Professor. You had a quote that from yourself here of something that you said. I think it's kind of applicable to what we'll be doing here today. All three of us have some background in the legal field. I'm a practicing lawyer. We have a professor. We have another lawyer who works in kind of the public policy realm and with the church. And here's what you wrote, and I wanted to just share this with our audience. You said most lawyers do not practice constitutional law. That's true. But members of the bar bear a special responsibility for understanding constitutional doctrine and communicating its meaning to non-lawyers. And then you said this: the role that constitutional law plays in our society depends in part on the interplay between the courts and the political culture. If judicial decisions are unintelligible to the polity and no group accepts responsibility for explaining the Constitution's evolving meaning to the polity, we undermine part of the foundation of the constitutional scheme of things. And I think what you're saying there is that it's important that we as a society understand the Constitution and how it works, and that we as lawyers kind of have a responsibility to help to communicate that meaning and what it's all about. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's right, Steve. And I want to emphasize the point about lawyers having some special responsibility to help other people who aren't legally trained understand what constitutional law is, how cases are decided, how the system works, because we really owe that to our community. We have this special expertise, and we shouldn't keep it secret. We should help people understand the constitutional system that we live in.
So let's jump into our discussion here today. And, Bettina, or Ms. Krause, in your magazine, in your magazine, Liberty, before, I think you just became editor, about 6 months ago?
Correct, yes.
Okay. And so I think in a previous issue, there was an article by a friend of mine, an acquaintance, Michael Peabody, who is a lawyer as well. And he wrote an article about free speech in there. And I think he kind of summarizes some of the things we're going to be talking about here today when he talks about both the risks and the benefits of free speech. Because I think we'd all agree, no matter where we're coming from with perspectives here, that freedom of speech has benefits, but there are also risks. And here's what he said. He said, one thing is sure, without free speech, the tyranny of ideas will emerge. Without free speech, faith proclamation will wither and retreat to the catacombs. But with the viral explosion of both information and disinformation, we risk the biblical warning, and he quotes from the New Testament epistle of 2 Timothy, the biblical warning of always learning, but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. And I think he kind of talks about how, this disinformation can really be dangerous too, right? And it can lead to a lot of confusion. So I want to address the first question to you, Bettina. Social media companies like Facebook and Twitter have been the source of controversy, over the past several years for flagging or removing speech they deem false about all sorts of things, from the vaccine, COVID-19, to even political speech, or removing politicians even for, violating their terms of service. At the same time, both of these platforms and others as well have been criticized for allowing certain speech on their platforms. And the First Amendment provides that the government shall not prohibit the freedom of speech. In contrast, these social media platforms are private companies. And here's a question: should people ever be censored on platforms like these? We can talk about, or otherwise. And in your opinion, what do you see the problem here being? And we don't need to get into, if you don't feel comfortable jumping into the constitutional law question first, give us kind of a set the stage for us. What do you see as being the issues here, and why is there a problem with what's going on in your mind, or is there not?
Okay, so you've opened with the biggest question you could possibly ask. Should there ever be censorship? Should there ever be content moderation on these platforms? And I think as Americans, we are so enculturated with the idea of our First Amendment free speech rights that it really comes as a shock to us, to many of us, to know that, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, applies only to government action. And in fact, the First Amendment actually protects the free speech rights of these social media companies as they express themselves through content moderation. And so just that very notion is alien, is unsettling to many people. And I know that we're going to explore the rest of that question throughout the rest of this discussion. But, I would say that there are sort of two ways of sort of envisioning what social media platforms are. And one is sort of as a new iteration in this evolution of communication that's taking place. So, you have newspapers, radio, television, social media platforms. And if you are looking at it from that perspective, then you are going to say, well, of course, traditional free speech, First Amendment rights, should operate as they do with these other platforms. The government has no right to say what editorial content should be in these platforms. But there's also a growing counter narrative that social media, they're not just, they're not in the lineage of these traditional media entities. They're new beasts. They're so big, they're so powerful that they're actually acting in ways that are quasi-governmental. And so that's where you get the argument that, yes, there should be an obligation on the part of the social media platforms to protect the free speech rights of the users, as would a government. So, that's just a very broad overview, but within that, there's many, many nuances and questions.
This is true. All right. So, Professor Brownstein, let's talk about the kind of the legal framework here, because I think what you brought up, Ms. Krause, is interesting. And a lot of us, when we think about the First Amendment, we say, the First Amendment protects my right to speak freely, right? We forget, as you have pointed out, that it actually only constrains the government from limiting our free speech rights. I can, limit the rights of, as a private corporation or something like that. If I own a platform, I, ostensibly could limit what is on that platform, just like a newspaper can decide what's going to go into the pages of, the newspaper. So, Professor, here, give us kind of the legal, framework of all of this, and tell us your opinion. Does the First Amendment constrain social media companies from censoring information on their platforms? Why or why not?
All right, that's actually a relatively easy question to answer, because as Bettina suggested, social media companies are private entities, and they are not subject to constitutional constraints. The United States Constitution applies exclusively to governmental entities except for the 13th Amendment, the prohibition against slavery. But all the rest of the Constitution is only applicable to governmental entities, not private institutions or private individuals. So the First Amendment does not constrain or prevent social media companies from choosing to censor or to excise certain messages from their platforms. They can publish what they want. They can decline to publish material that they view as inappropriate or unacceptable. At a much smaller scale, you could decide that you don't like what Bettina or what I'm saying, and you could shut us down. You could excise us from this program. It's your program, your church's program, and you are under no obligation to allow diverse opinions to be expressed on your platform. Now, obviously, Facebook is much, much bigger than your program. And there are people who say that we should extend state action to cover institutions of this magnitude. That argument has not been favorably received by the courts. State action, the meaning of state action has varied over time. And there are some exceptions to the general understanding that you really have to be a government actor in order for the Constitution to apply to you. But these exceptions are very limited in their scope. So one is the court years ago in a case called Marsh versus Alabama said that if you're a company town, companies used to create their own little cities next to a factory, and they owned everything. They owned every building, they owned the streets, and the private company essentially took over all municipal functions. And his early Supreme Court decision said, well, if that's what the company is doing, we're going to treat it as a state actor for constitutional purposes. So people have a right to distribute leaflets on the streets of this company town. But later cases made it clear that this is a very unique and limited precedent. And the courts have said, if you're going to argue that a private entity is engaged in a public function and should be treated like government for constitutional purposes, you have to demonstrate that this public function is one that is exclusively provided by government. It can't be a function that's shared by both private entities and governmental entities. There are just very, very few exclusive government functions out there. Now, in California, for the people who are in the audience who live in California, you may know that as a matter of state constitutional law, California has the Pruneyard Doctrine. And Pruneyard has expanded the scope of state action so that people have a constitutional right to distribute leaflets at large shopping centers in California. California Supreme Court said in the Pruneyard case that we're going to treat these shopping centers as public forums. They're just like the streets and parks, which people have a constitutional right to have access to. But this Pruneyard Doctrine has not been favorably received either by the federal courts or by many other state courts. So the short answer to your question is, does the First Amendment constrain the decisions by social media companies as to what they will publish? No, it doesn't.
So what about the argument that, you go back several years to the fairness doctrine with broadcast media, right? And some are arguing that we should bring that back, but apply it to social media platforms. What do you both think about that? Something of that nature where, there needs to be some sort of, and I think what you brought up, Bettina, earlier was the concept. There's this other narrative that, these social medias companies are so pervasive and it impacts our society in such an important way that there needs to be some protections there, essentially, right? So that speech is not suppressed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you see lawmakers, both at the state and national levels, sort of rushing to fill this, what they perceive as a vacuum of regulation. And they're seeing the problems that you've described, Steve. On one hand, you have progressive Elizabeth Warren, Senator Klobuchar. They're all proposing regulatory frameworks that would limit hate speech, that would sort of carve out from Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the liability shield for social media content that perpetuates things like false information, medical information during a pandemic. So they're concerned with misinformation and hate speech and whatnot. Then you have, on the far right, you have Senator Rubio with his proposal. He wants to make some forms of political viewpoints. You can't censor political viewpoints. You have to give this sort of even-handed approach. And so just in the past 18 months, you have more than 20 different frameworks being proposed in Congress alone. And then, of course, you've got the Florida law, which was passed, but then put on hold. And then you have the Texas law. So what I'm saying is that people are recognizing the problem, and they're both understanding that harms can come from unfettered, social media action, but they don't know how to regulate it. And my problem with all of these frameworks, almost all of them, is that each one puts its thumb on the scale of the political ideology that it represents, of the drafting party. And so it becomes tainted with political issues. And so it's very, very hard in our, First Amendment context to come up with a regulatory scheme that doesn't run afoul of the First Amendment and doesn't open up these sort of issues of political ideological bias in the framework. It's a very, very difficult thing. It's not like we're the Europeans, who have far more leeway in regulating speech.
Mm-hmm. Professor, what do you agree with what Ms. Krause just said?
I do, pretty much. I think if the fairness doctrine was reenacted today, it would be struck down as unconstitutional.
Okay.
And what I'd like to do is to suggest that people distinguish between two kinds of government interventions. I think Bettina suggested that. I'm just trying to place it in a doctrinal framework. So on the one hand, people want the government to tell social media companies to censor certain kinds of speech because it's hurtful, it's dangerous, it's offensive, it's hateful. And that violates free speech prohibitions against viewpoint discrimination and content discrimination. You can only tell private entities that they can't speak and they can't communicate certain messages if you can satisfy strict scrutiny review. Very, very high standard of review. The regulation has to be necessary to the furtherance of a compelling state interest. And in free speech cases, it almost never is. Almost never satisfies that standard of review. So that's one kind of issue. Government tells social media, get more in the business of censoring bad speech. All right. And we'll tell you what the bad speech is. All right. The other issue is called the compelled speech problem, where the government tells the publisher, here social media companies, we want you to publish things that you're declining to publish. This is more of the right-wing criticism of the social media companies. It says you're excluding too much conservative messages, and we want you to provide a platform for those messages as well as the more liberal messages. Now, compelled speech is just as unconstitutional as prohibiting speech. indeed, the current court is extremely reluctant to allow the government to compel speech. I think it's gone way too far in that area. But there's no question that under current doctrine, government cannot tell publishers that they have to say certain things. There's a famous case, Miami Herald versus Trujillo, where the state of Florida required newspapers to give candidates who had been criticized on the editorial page of the newspaper a right of reply. The newspaper had to give them space to say, you know what, the newspaper is saying about me, that's false. It's not fair. I'm really a good guy. You should vote for me. And the Supreme Court said that's blatantly unconstitutional. You cannot tell a newspaper. They have to fill their pages with certain messages. And the rule of that case would apply to social media companies as well. You can't tell social media companies they have to publish certain messages. They have to be an open platform for certain points of view. Now, the problem, as Bettina suggested, is that I tell my students freedom of speech is a political good. It's an extremely valuable political good. It's also an extremely expensive political good. And that means that when we protect it as rigorously as we do in the United States, there will be consequences. There will be harms. People will be hurt. There is no question about that. That's the price we pay for this freedom. And we're always asking, is the price too high? There are situations where we say, well, we're willing to pay a heavy price to protect freedom of speech, but we're not willing to go this far. And so to try to bring this back to religious liberty and the well-being of religious minorities in the United States, there are many religious minorities who feel like their rights, their physical safety is being jeopardized by extremely violent and hostile messages that are being communicated on social media. I know the Jewish community and the Muslim community both feel that they have to take additional precautions to provide security to their houses of worship because hate crimes and hate incidents against both Jews and Muslims have been skyrocketing over the last few years. So the question is, well, what do you do? How do you limit the costs that this freedom of speech is imposing on religious minorities? And the answer is, under current free speech doctrine, it's very, very difficult to do that. Hate speech is fully protected.
Sure.
Even lies receive some significant protection. Incitement to violence, very, very hard to satisfy the Brandenburg standard of what constitutes assignment. So if we stick with the doctrine that's developed to date, it's extremely difficult to limit the kind of messages, hurtful and hateful and violent as they may be, that are published by social media companies.
So the First Amendment protects false information, it protects lying, it protects hate speech, it protects all of those things. But if a social media company wants to, like Facebook, let's say, or Twitter wants to say our community guidelines or terms of service do not allow that kind of speech, they are free to do so. That's not a violation of the First Amendment for a private company to do that. Right. But Bettina, you're kind of arguing that by that company doing that kind of runs a risk of perhaps suppressing other kinds of speech, or at least you're saying that some people are saying that. What do you think, let me ask you this, Bettina, is the solution to this problem? We've talked about kind of the problem. What do you see as being a good path forward that's a good balance, or whatever the word might be?
Well, if I had that answer, I'd give up my day job.
You and me both. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I think, we're talking about these issues in a legal framework, and that's clearly we have to do that. But it is just as much a technological challenge as a legal challenge. You talked about Facebook's community standards. Well, we really don't know that much about Facebook's community standards. They have a very opaque method of content moderation. And, this idea of the algorithm has sort of gained mythic status when it comes to Facebook. This system of prioritizing information on Facebook, up to 10,000 different points of data and factors, which will determine what information appears in your Facebook feed. And so, you have these technological issues behind the scene. And, we saw with the whistleblower who recently testified in Congress that this technological aspect is really significant if we're really to understand what the problem is, because basically what she said, according to her testimony and her documents that she produced, Facebook knowingly prioritizes information that engages people. And that's not as benign as it sounds, because what engages us? Things that enrage us, things that make us fearful. And so, in a way, Facebook is knowingly weaponizing human psychology to amplify harmful content that can have real life, real world consequences. So we're discussing the legal framework, and the legal framework, as Professor Brownstein says, it's clear. The social media companies are legally doing as they wish. But, lawmakers are looking at it and saying, should we allow this? Is there some way that we can moderate or mitigate the harms of this sort of business model and this technological framework that companies such as Facebook are operating on? And so I have seen suggestions, and there is actually a piece of legislation that was introduced that actually tries to sidestep this issue of, First Amendment, the government can't tell the social media companies what to do, sidestep it by focusing on this algorithm and asking for greater transparency so that consumers are armed with the information that they need to either push back against the companies, to pressure the companies, to make informed decisions about how they engage with social media. Now, I don't know what Professor Brownstein thinks of the constitutionality of that, but that is one framework which to me is very attractive, because it avoids us sort of going down this track of the government telling social media what they can censor and how to censor it, which is just fundamentally dangerous. But it arms consumers with information that may help mitigate what is clearly demonstrable harm that comes from the business model and the technological model of these platforms.
Okay, so Professor Brownstein, what do you think about that?
Well, I think Bettina's clearly on the right track. What we're looking for is content neutral ways to try to reduce the problem. And just let me say in the beginning that one of the reasons that the problem is as difficult to resolve as it is because some people say, well, look, why should we protect speech that is so obviously horrible and false and dangerous? And the basic answer is that what is hateful, what is dangerous, what is unreasonably violent is in the eyes of the beholder. And whenever you give government the authority to regulate speech, you're assuming it's going to be regulated in a way that makes sense to you. The speech that you think is hurtful and hateful is going to be censored. But it almost always turns out that once the government has this power, it starts censoring speech that you thought was not only benign, but was actually beneficial. And there's just lots of examples of that happening in Canada and in European countries where they allow censorship and they discover that the censorship isn't being targeted at the people they wanted it to be targeted.
Interesting.
So transparency is, Facebook and the social media companies shouldn't be able to have their cake and eat it too.
Right.
So if they're claiming that they're doing a lot to reduce the amount of hateful, violent, dangerous speech that's being communicated on their platforms, they ought to do it in a way that we as the people and as observers could understand what they're doing and monitor it and see whether they're really living up to their claims of doing the best they can to exclude this noxious material. I know so little about the technology that I can't really evaluate some of the suggestions that have been offered, but I know one that people have discussed is that if there was a way to just slow things down so that when things were placed on a social media platform, it didn't immediately go around the world in 5 minutes, that there were constraints on how many times it could be republished and how fast. And if that applied to everything, you could argue it was neutral, it applied to all messages. And that might create something of a bit of a buffer, a limit on how fast these dangerous messages could be republished. Because remember, part of the idea of our free speech model is that there ought to be time for good speech to counter bad speech. That was kind of the idea. That's what Brandenburg says. Has to be a threat of imminent, immediate unlawful conduct. Because if you give a speech and it may cause people to engage in unlawful conduct 3 days later, well, according to Brandeis and Holmes and the great architects of our free speech doctrine, well, that gives other speakers time to engage these bad messages and to counter them with good messages. The problem with social media is that everything happens so fast that by the time people even see that the bad messages are being communicated, it's awfully difficult to counter them, to even track, to see how far they've been published throughout the world. To maybe slowing things down, transparency, they won't solve the problem in its entirety, but they might on the margin reduce it to some extent.
Right. And if I could just jump in there,
yes.
Professor Brownstein is right. It's not just the speed at which it's happening, it's also the volume. You have 300 hours of video uploaded every minute on YouTube. You have 500 million tweets per day, 2.5 billion Facebook users globally. The volume that it's happening at overwhelms the capacity of the artificial intelligence that is that is doing the sort of the blunt editing, the blunt content moderation. It overwhelms even the artificial intelligence, not to mention the limited number of human moderators who are trying to deal with all the borderline cases. And so, Professor Brownstein's absolutely correct. The speed at which things are happening, the volume at which they're happening means that we can require something legally, but whether technologically it's even possible or feasible, who knows? And at this point, probably not.
So let's shift here a little bit. And so we've been talking about, folks who have concerns about social media companies, censoring content, and, potentially that could implicate religious expression at some point. And maybe it has in some cases, right? Some people would argue that it has with the whole vaccine, being able to share your views on the vaccine, which a lot of people hold as religious views. Let's talk in a different area. There are other folks who have strong views about the history, for example, of racism and slavery in America. And they want to talk about those issues. And to them, it might even be a religious, like a justice issue that kind of, comes together with their faith in some way. And of course, over the past, year or so, we've seen a lot of bills introduced in various state legislatures, and even school boards have made decisions to prohibit certain types of speech in the classroom, or to remove certain types of books from school libraries, not allow teachers to teach certain types of topics that relate to racism or the history of America in a way that portrays America in an unflattering light or is deemed unpatriotic. So maybe first question for you, Professor Brownstein, number one, and this is a big question, and I realize maybe too broad, but are these bills, generally constitutional, number one, when it comes to this, the First Amendment, or is this not even a First Amendment issue?
It's a great question, and there isn't an answer.
Okay.
I mean, part of it depends on the content of the specific bill, and the bills vary dramatically in what they say. But there's one United States Supreme Court decision, Board of Education versus Pico, a 1982 decision, that is directly on point. It deals with the removal of books from a school library because the school board disagreed with the content. They thought the books were too liberal. And Pico is a very narrow decision, and it's a plurality opinion. It was really, there wasn't a clear majority on the court. Justice Brennan wrote the opinion. And it's full of very difficult distinctions to justify. So Justice Brennan said, the holding in this case only applies to removing books from a library. It doesn't apply to acquiring books. That's a different question. It doesn't apply to what teachers say in the classroom. That's a different question. It just applies to taking books off the shelves that were already there. And what Justice Brennan said was, it depends on why you're doing that. If you take a book off the shelves because its content is pervasively vulgar, that would be okay. Or if you think it deals with material that isn't educationally suitable for your students, that would be okay. But if you take the book off the shelves because you disagree with the ideas and information that's being communicated, that's unconstitutional. Now, of course, the problem with Brennan's analysis is the school boards who are taking the books off the shelves, one often will know enough not to say, we're taking it off the shelves because we disagree with its content. What they'll say is, we're taking it off the shelves because the material isn't educationally suitable. And that may mean because the content is problematic for whatever reason. So it's a hard issue because running a school or a library involves the exercise of editorial discretion. And unless you want the federal courts to be de facto school boards and librarians of every public library and every public school in the United States, you really don't want federal judges reviewing every content-based decision that's made by a librarian, a teacher, an administrator, or a school board. It's the same kind of thing with a museum. Curators of museums take content into account. They just don't hang on the walls every picture that someone donates to them. They exercise judgment. And when that's the kind of government function that's at issue, it's pretty hard to make the argument that we should be denying government the ability to discriminate on the basis of viewpoint and content when that is so intrinsically part of the job that we're asking teachers and schools to do. Now, with regard to this issue about racism and critical legal theories, critical legal studies, if I can just take a couple of minutes and let me tell you how I approached something like that issue when I was a visiting professor at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Now, because I teach at Davis. In Davis, the students are overwhelmingly liberal. At BYU, the students are incredibly bright, thoughtful, respectful, but they're generally conservative. It's a different audience than my students at Davis. So when I was teaching equal protection and affirmative action, I was trying to figure out a way to make arguments about why we should take race into account in affirmative action programs. I wanted to make it accessible to people. And I asked them this question. The Olympics were going on at the time. And I said, who is proud of the performance of American athletes at the Olympics? Everybody raised their hands. Easy question. Who actually contributed anything to the success of those athletes? No hands went up. So no one did. So I said, so, okay, it's okay to be proud of something your country does and the people in your country do, even though you had nothing to do with bringing that about. And everyone said yes. And I said, is the reverse true as well? Can you feel embarrassed, guilty, or shameful? Different emotion than pride when your country does something that you think was wrong, even though you had nothing to do with bringing about that shameful, hurtful act. And that's something I wanted people to think about, because it seems to me, without getting into a lot of technical, critical race study issues, if you're proud of the United States, and I am, I think we're really blessed to be in this country. If you're proud to be here and you're proud of the achievements and accomplishments of our country, of what America has done, even though you may have had a minimal contribution to bringing them about, then you also have to be open to the contrary emotion, which is to say, when the United States has made mistakes, and all countries have, I should feel remorse, I should feel responsibility and accountability for those wrongful acts. The two go together. And, I will say that argument was accessible to the students at BYU. They didn't feel like that was denigrating their beliefs or indoctrinating them. They thought that was a way to think about this that they hadn't thought about. And I think it's a way of raising the issue without getting into things like white guilt. I don't believe in white guilt. I believe in American responsibility.
Sure.
Yeah. And, just building on what Professor Brownstein has said, as an issue of policy, it seems that this sort of nuanced approach that we've just heard, I mean, that becomes impossible when you see the vitriol and the anger and the bitterness and the scenes that we've seen playing out at local school boards. And, and we see the rhetoric surrounding some of the state level legislation that's being passed, which is so divisive, which is so unnuanced. So, simply as a matter of policy, I would say that this approach, this rush to legislate one way or the other, whichever party has the upper hand, it legislates according to their ideology. Instead of that, having the discipline and having the wherewithal to stop and have a more nuanced discussion should be our aim. It concerns me when we have this sort of wholesale resort to even the idea of censorship.
I agree with that, Bettina. And, too many people are screaming about what they think their children are being taught. And they should be saying much more quietly, is what's going on in the classroom helping my child to learn the skills of critical thinking, which they could apply to both right-wing and left-wing positions.
Sure. Ms. Krause, I want to ask you a question here, and that is, first of all, let's tie all this in with, religious liberty. That's why we're here today. And what current challenges do you see for religious speech in the public square? Maybe not just here in the United States. I know you deal with you look at things internationally, I'm sure, in your role as, the editor of Liberty Magazine and so on. So what challenges do you see, first of all, to religious speech in the public square? And secondly, what do you think we ought to do about those challenges.
Sure, and you're absolutely right. I mean, what we're talking about here in the US, in terms of censorship, I guess you could say, of religious ideas on social media platforms, which, is a reality. It's not an imaginary problem. And, not to delve too far into the realm of anecdote, but, in many of my workplaces, discussions such as issue of comprehensive non-discrimination legislation for LGBT community from the perspective of a conservative Christian faith, but which is actually supporting non-discrimination protections. But because it's using religious language around that topic, has earned us Facebook jail time. And we, in my last workplace, we still are not able to share on Facebook articles from our website because clearly, some third-party user has flagged us as concerning because of our discussion of this topic. So what I'm saying is that within the domestic realm, these aren't imaginary problems. But when you look at it in terms of the global picture, I'm hesitant to get too exercised about it here. I'm not saying it's not important. It is. It should be addressed. It should be discussed. But, take, for instance, India, which is Facebook's largest market. You have a huge number of users, something like 35 million users on Facebook, 40,000 on WhatsApp. And yet you have time and time again these instances of violent mobs that are being instigated and fueled by social media messages and images. There was one just recently, there was a fictitious video of apparently a Muslim man who was spitting on nursing staff and transmitting COVID. And it resulted in deaths as violent mobs took to the streets. There was another instance recently in one of the northern provinces there was an accusation posted on Facebook that a gentleman, a Muslim man, was keeping beef in his refrigerator. And it resulted in the death of this man. And, there were leaked documents just a couple of years ago from Facebook, which showed that Facebook was aware of this inability it had to confront instances of violent, hate speech that were causing real world harms. And it simply didn't have enough local language content moderators, so it wasn't able to deal with it. And so where Facebook chooses to invest its resources in dealing with this sort of thing can mean life and death in some situations. This was all taking place in India around the time of January 6th, where we had the civil uprising, at the Capitol. You saw Facebook leap into action and, pledge to more resources. It was going to deal with this conspiracy theories and hate speech and what have you. Yet the bigger, which is important, which is good, yet why was it not also investing the necessary resources in content moderation to deal with this sort of religious violence in India? And it's not just, it's many other places around the world. So when we're talking about religious discrimination and religious freedom violations, I think we need to think globally. That's where the real problems lie.
You bring up an interesting issue with, the LGBTQ rights and religious, conservative religious organizations in America. And I think that is something that we could talk about more, and how, because that is an example, I suppose, of, suppression of religious speech, perhaps, right? Or at least saying to those organizations who don't, I think there's oftentimes a policy that has to be signed on to by an organization using like Google, for example, right? And saying, I agree with this. And maybe a religious organization can't do that. And so then they can't use that platform. But then we kind of get back into the whole big question of, can a private corporation do that? And it seems that they can. I want to finish up here today. I really want to thank both of you again for being here and just discussing these issues. We could talk about a lot more, and we've just kind of scratched the surface with all of these issues, I feel like. But let's finish up with something practical for those who are watching. And I would like to invite both of you to share some, principles or guidelines, tips, I guess you could call them maybe, with our viewers of how do you navigate, the current environment in our society of all this misinformation everywhere. Like, how do you decide what is good information and what isn't? I think a lot of people struggle with that. And, I've had people personally, contact me personally saying, hey, how do I know? They send me an email forward or a post and they think it's true. And I might point out, well, here's why I, think that you ought to be skeptical of this. Let me hear from you. If you'd like to share, what are some things that you could share with our listeners and viewers that might be helpful to them in this area that help you? And whoever wants to go first.
Go ahead, Bettina.
Ladies first. How about that?
Okay, sure. It's not an easy question that you're asking because it's not self-evident when you're looking at a post or information online how credible it is. It can trip up anyone. I mean, so everyone needs to be looking at what they see online through a critical filter. One of the best tips I got on this was to ask the basic journalistic questions about what you're seeing online, the who, what, where, and why. And so, who is saying what you're reading? Is it a credible source? Is it a source you even recognize? Is it a person within your network? Is it someone outside your network? Is it someone who's personally trustworthy, who's sharing this information? If it is from an organization, is it a well-recognized organization? Do your homework on that, and what? I mean, look at the language. Is it emotive? Is it sort of absolutist, as in everything and everyone and always? Does it use these sort of absolute terms? And because if it does, that's a red flag. If it's a more academic neutral tone, then you have higher chance of it being credible material. And the question of why, have a look and consider why this information is being shared. Is there either a commercial gain that could be made by the person who's sharing it? Is it sort of a political thing that they're trying to push, an agenda? Is it? Ask the why question and really dig down deep into that. But again, it's not easy, and I think we all need to do our due diligence whenever we're online.
And I think this really, what I hear you saying too, requires us to be honest with ourselves, to question our own biases, right? And to be willing to listen to information that we may not, be biased towards, right? And so, or agree with naturally. And so I think that those are good, some good guidelines, some good tips to go by. Professor Brownstein, anything you'd like to add? I know you said you're not on social media really,
right.
but listen, we all navigate the real world, and we're confronted with this stuff. Just even in the news media, I assume you probably watch some of that here and there. How do you deal with all of this?
Okay, I thought a lot of what Bettina said was excellent. Was very thoughtful and very helpful. What I would add is, if you have credible sources, like I work at a university with a world-class medical center, and what I learn from the doctors, the practitioners, the professors at Davis, that has a lot of credibility to me. And when somebody says something that is completely an opposite to what the consensus is among the scientific leaders of the community where I live, I'm going to discount it. I'm going to demand a lot of evidence before I view it as a credible argument. So most of us have some people or some sources that we've learned over time are credible, or at least trying the best they can to be credible, even though they make mistakes. And if you're reading something that's totally inconsistent with what these credible sources are expressing, that's a red flag for me. The other thing I look to is I think there are a lot of difficult issues out there, moral, political, policy, religious issues where there isn't any one easy answer. There's benefits and costs on both sides. And I'm looking for an analysis that recognizes that. An analysis that views everything as completely one-sided. I don't think I have a lot to learn from that discussion. So I take an issue like abortion, which I view as a morally complex issue. And to the extent someone views it as an extremely simple issue, I don't think I have a lot to learn from that person, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I've written articles about it. I may be wrong in my judgments, but I don't think I'm wrong in my determination that this is a complex question. There's a lot of both facts and moral analysis that could lead people to support one position as opposed to another. And when someone trivializes the other side completely, somebody who says pro-choice, well, that's like saying what flavor ice cream you'd like to eat. That's a choice too. Well, I'm not interested in that argument. I mean, the person who writes that isn't taking the issue seriously. When someone says, what does pro-life mean? You mean the life of a mosquito? Again, I'm not interested in that analysis. They're not taking the position seriously and trying to understand, why people would take the position that they do. I want to read something where people say, there are some difficult questions here and there are some thoughtful arguments on both sides. And I end up favoring X versus Y, but not because I discount completely the arguments that are being made by the other side. So I look to that. Now, of course, there are limits to that. You may have read in a newspaper about this unfortunate school where the teacher was told, you've got to present both sides to all controversial issues. So he said, well, if you're going to talk about the Holocaust, you've got to talk about people who deny the existence of the Holocaust. And of course, got in a lot of trouble because there are some issues where there aren't two sides. There are a lot of issues where there are. I think we're better off. I would like to see more op-eds. And what a newspaper will do now is have two op-eds, one taking one position, the other taking the opposite position. And the newspaper says we're being neutral. I would like them to have one longer op-ed where the same author says there are some difficult issues here and important arguments on both sides, and I have respect for both of them.
Sure.
And this is how I worked my way through those arguments. I think that's a better approach. We rarely see it in the media.
Yeah, and what I hear you saying too is that I think that this is kind of what I'm getting is that we need to be humble. We need to have humility, be willing to admit that we could be wrong, looking at, the other side of an issue that we, again, may have an opinion on. And I think there needs to be respect. I think that also that's something I'm hearing in what you're saying. Well, it's been good to have both of you here on the our Religious Liberty webinar today. Thank you again for taking the time to do this. Really appreciate your thoughts and your input here. And I want to just finish up with a verse from the Old Testament prophet Micah. And I think it kind of summarizes what both of you we've been talking about this whole time, and how, at least what it ought to look like for people of faith. And what you just said, Professor Brownstein, there a minute ago made me think of this verse where he said, what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God? I think if we could live by that simple maxim, a lot of the problems in life and society, if people of faith would live that way, would probably not be here. And so that's a goal for us, I feel, as people of faith.
Amen.
Thank you again.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yes, very good meeting you, Bettina, and thank you for inviting me, Steve.
Absolutely.